Thank you for turning out in such numbers. Very honoured to have you here tonight to hear the story. Thank you too for giving up live television coverage of the Hobbit heroes and for braving what is forecast to be a blast of Antarctic air this evening with hail in it, apparently. I'd just like to acknowledge a couple of people here tonight. From the publishing side is Barbara Larson, who's here. Barbara, could you just stand up so people can... Thank you. Barbara is, some of you will know Barbara from her work with Longacre Press. The office is closed now. Random House purchased the imprint and all the backlist and so on. But Barbara was the commissioning editor for this project, and thanks Barbara for doing that. And that's good. We have some people from some distance, from as far as British Columbia today, who are with my family to the left of them. We have a fellow Antarctica, John Darby, here. Anybody else been to Antarctica in this room? Oh, wow. Good. Couple of people. That's great. Welcome to you all, anyway. Antarctica is the last discovered of all our 7 continents. But the heroics there that you find there probably would outnumber the heroics of the exploration of all other 6 continents put together. And I'm going to take you through a story tonight which will probably bear out that. There's the story, of course, of Ernest Shackleton. And most people today would think of the Endurance and associate the name of the Endurance with Ernest Shackleton, and why not? It was a story of survival and heroism. But there is only one memorial to Shackleton, a physical memorial apart from the landmarks that you can visit, and that is on the screen at the moment at Cape Royds. The Nimrod hut, named after the expedition ship. Note the red door there. I'll come to that in a moment. I just wanted to have a few pictures to describe why I became involved in this project, and then I'll take you through the story more or less in the way it's told in the book. Just a map that is demonstrating the Ross Dependency area, and I've got the laser on here actually, but I don't know if you can see it, but Ross Island is in here, and I'll come to the next map that shows it a bit closer. 3,600 kilometres up to Dunedin from there, so a long way. The Ross Ice Shelf in purple there, the largest ice shelf in the world, the size of France, and the South Pole down at the bottom, around about 1,400 kilometres from Ross Island to the South Pole. But the reason this was such an important area for the early explorers, the heroic era explorers, was that this was the closest approach for a ship to the South Pole. And here is Cape Royds, right there, halfway between Scott Base, McMurdo Station here, and Cape Bird on the eastern side of Ross Island. Over here, the famous dry valleys, and you can just see it says McMurdo Ice Shelf, which is an offshoot of the Ross Ice Shelf. In January 2007, I was investigating researching a book called, or about New Zealand-US relationship in Antarctica over a 50-year period. And as a bit of a side trip, actually, because the Americans weren't involved with this project, but I went to Cape Royds. I spent an hour there and was lucky enough to find a nice calm day with plenty of sunshine, and the New Zealand hut conservators out there in force doing their work. If you look at the down here, you'll see a door which replaced that red door. For me, it kind of it was an example of the extent that New Zealand is going to conserve this hut and faithfully conserve it to 1908 conditions. It's made of Scots pine, the same as the door that was in the original hut. It's made of the same aged timber, actually, and of course of the same design. It is, for my money anyway, the most picturesque part of Ross Island. In the distance you see the southernmost penguin colony in the world, the Daily penguins, living at the Cape Royds headland. Pony Lake is under the ice in the distance, and you're surrounded by all this volcanic rock. And there's the door. In the 1 hour that I happened to be there, the door was replaced. It is the door that separates a reasonably comfortable existence, if you were down there with Shackleton in 1908, from a survival exercise on the outside of it. Because the conditions here, as we'll see as we go through, have been pretty severe. On the left is James Blake, the son of the late Sir Peter Blake, and he was there doing a Peter Blake Trust youth leadership course, and he was there for about 6 weeks. On the right, a carpenter from Cromwell, Steve Brown. And here's what happened after I left. James went under the hut, and they started excavating some cases of whisky. And there he is, looking very cheerful about it. The whisky had been discovered, the cases had been discovered the year before, but really they didn't get to confirm that it was whisky and that they were full of bottles of it until the summer of 2006-07. And not far from there was something else, alcoholic. This is the metal bung of a beer barrel that was produced in Dunedin. This, some of you will be able to read that, J. Spate and Co. Dunedin. And there were 2 barrels of beer that were donated to Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. So after that visit, of course, I knew about the whisky discovery, but really the story wasn't complete until some bottles were sampled in Scotland. And as we'll see as we run through the story, the whisky was recreated. So what you're going to see now is the story unfold in the 3 parts in which I've written it. The story is a narrative, and I've tried to keep it kind of just flowing along from the time of Shackleton's earliest days. He was born in Ireland, west of Dublin, on a farm. His father, a farmer, decided that things were pretty tough for farming, and he moved to medicine, as you do, I guess, if you're a farmer. And he went off to Dublin and then on to England to study, and finally brought the family over to England when Shackleton was age 10. You see him there at age 16 on the left in a cadet's uniform of the White Star Line. There were some apocryphal stories about him running away from Dulwich College when he was 16 to run away to sea, but unfortunately they weren't correct. He was organised into a job with the White Star Line by a family friend. And on the right, a young man. He grew up in a household that really eschewed alcohol. Virtually, the household, the Shackleton home, was teetotal, and in fact, Ernest and his sisters would go campaigning with the Band of Hope, which was a temperance society on the streets of London, outside pubs, just protesting that alcohol was indeed a demon drink. So he came from this background. His family were originally from West Yorkshire and moved to Ireland back in the 17th or 18th century. In 1901, he ceased his 10 years of merchant navy service and took up a position as 3rd Lieutenant in the first of Robert Falcon Scott's expedition. So this is the 1901-4 that stayed 2 winters down there. You see Shackleton here on the left. In the middle is R.F. Scott, and on the right his great friend and supporter Edward Wilson, Dr. Edward Wilson. And there they are setting out on a bid to reach the South Pole. They didn't get anywhere near it. They didn't even get off that Ross ice shelf and onto the polar plateau. But nonetheless, they made a new farthest south and returned somewhat in distress because symptoms of scurvy had shown up, and particularly they were showing up in the young Ernest Shackleton. For whatever reason, Scott might have privately have had about Shackleton, he decided to send him home, Shackleton home, after the first winter when they got back. Shackleton, I think, was protesting this decision, but nonetheless, almost as soon as he got back, was planning to have another expedition. And this happened in 1907. He got together a team, an expedition that eventually comprised 14 men with him to stay at Cape Royds for the year, and he ordered a whole bunch of supplies. He knew it was important to order as much food and as much variety of food as he could. He ordered, as we now know, 25 cases of whisky, 12 cases of brandy and 2 of port from a company called McKinley's, which were based in Leith and in Inverness. And who you see there is the fifth generation descendant of the founder, of the McKinley founder. This is Neil McKinley. I photographed him near his home in Calveen, near Pitlochry, with the original order that Shackleton had written out. On the right there you see an advertisement for a product of McKinley's around about the time of the turn of the 20th century. Before that, it had actually been the whisky of choice for the House of Commons in London, and is probably one of the reasons why Shackleton would have ordered it. Another reason would be that he worked in Edinburgh as a young man before he was married, working for the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, and may have come across the McKinley name at that time as well. And here it is a bit closer up for you to see. There's actually a typo in there because he's got 25 and then in brackets 20, but there were 25 cases, and the ship at Nimrod did sail with those, and the 12 of old liqueur brandy, the 6 cases of port. Thanks to the Dunedin Public Library for providing some advice on whether that was Ernest Shackleton's handwriting or not, and the advice was that it was not, and then therefore would have been the handwriting of his manager, Alfred Reed, but he certainly, Shackleton, did sign it. As you can see down the bottom, E.H. Shackleton, Commander. And here is where this whisky came from. This is the Glenmore distillery at Inverness, beside the Caledonian Canal where they drew the water from. And it would have been, this distillery was founded in the early 1890s, and they would have got together the basis for the whisky from about the mid-1890s, where I begin my story. It included, the story about the manufacture of the whisky included the procurement from Orkney Islands, from an island there called Eday, in the middle of the group, of a consignment of peat, which was used to fuel the kilns that malted the barley. And I described that process in the book as well. And here's Neville Peat meeting Orkney Peat, photographed by my wife who's here, Mary Hammonds, at the peat fields that are still operated today by the Highland Park Distillery. Okay, well, let's set off on the expedition. Shackleton wanted to get a beautiful new vessel called the Bjorn, but didn't have enough money. In fact, he never ever had enough money for any of his expeditions, but somehow managed to beg, borrow and steal some of these supplies. But of course the ship he had to buy, and he was helped out in this by a person he'd worked for, a Scottish industrialist, William Beardmore, whose name Shackleton applied to the famous and the largest of all glaciers, the Beardmore in Antarctica. So here they are here. The ship Nimrod was a 40-year-old whaler in rather rough condition, whaler and a sealer. Apparently when you went down below decks you could still smell the remains of seals down there, which would have been rather horrible, I should think. But they tidied her up and had her ready for departure. To his Shackleton's surprise, he was under royal command to appear at the Cowes Regatta, and that's why you see King Edward VII and his Queen Alexandra on board there, and an artist's impression of that, inspecting some of the gear there, a sledge and a tent, one of which is a polar tent erected there, presumably for the benefit of showing the royals. Down the bottom right, when the ship got to Littleton, they loaded these cases, 2,000 cases in a kind of plywood called Venesta, and that was a brilliant plan by Shackleton to make sure he could fit all of the supplies in. He designed the case, and they were all of the same dimensions. Dunedin comes into the picture with the donation, well, it was actually the offer of a ship to tow the Nimrod. She could never have got down to Antarctica and back with the coal. She simply couldn't carry enough coal to do that, along with all the other supplies. The 10 horses, for example, rather heavy in themselves. They were Manchurian ponies, some dogs, and all the other equipment. One car, as you'll see in a minute. But the Cunha was a steamship from the Union Company based in Dunedin, and Sir James Mills offered Shackleton, whose reputation really had preceded him here, as a bit of a wonder of polar exploration. So he provided the ship, and there is the Cunha, rather hidden from view from the Nimrod, which was being towed at this point. That massive wave apparently came on board Nimrod and it caused quite a bit of damage. But nonetheless, she got 2/3 of the way down there from Littleton and made it safely there, and then headed into pack ice and then sea ice, and finally they arrived at Cape Royds. So there you are, there, Cape Royds. They tracked along the face of the ice barrier, as they called it, the Ross Ice Shelf, looking for a landing place there, but found no way in. The cliffs were just too forbidding. The whole place looked different from when Shackleton had seen it with the Discovery, with Scott's Discovery in the earlier expedition. So he reluctantly had to come back into McMurdo Sound. Scott had said, "You will not use my hut, the Discovery hut, which is down here at Hut Point. It's right, very close, a stone's throw from McMurdo Station. You will not use that hut. In fact, I don't even really want you leaping off from Ross Island to the South Pole at all, because I sort of think that's my territory." This is the message from Scott. But Shackleton ignored it. He had no choice anyway. And so they set up their hut, which I've described as about having the floor space of a very large tourist coach. And the 14 men got in there, and they set up, we'll see that in a moment, cubicles, 2 to a cubicle, with one cabin for, as he called it, for Shackleton himself. He was the only one to have private space. And this is photographed in the winter of 1908, with the sea ice out in front instead of water there. It normally breaks out around this headland. Just after they had got the hut more or less finished, a blizzard came along and covered everything up with snow and ice, including all a lot of the packaging cases. I've never worked out exactly whether they kept most of the whisky cases outside or whether they were under the hut, all of them, or in Frank Wild's store at the front of it. But nonetheless, they were somewhere. And what they tended to do was place all these boxes in various clumps, separated from each other in case there was a fire. Fire being the worst thing that could happen to you on an expedition, even today. In about the middle of that photograph is the experimental car that they took south, a vehicle that proved to be quite hopeless in the snow and not much better on the ice, but on flat going on ice, where there was a little bit of purchase for the tyres, they made some progress with it, but it never really got off the McMurdo sea ice. Among the personalities, and I've tried in this book to describe them and to give you a picture of the social life of the expedition. Most biographies and other stories, the books about the expedition, of course, does highlight the exploration, which I cover, but not as much as I cover the social life, the interaction of people, what Shackleton himself called the inside view of men on an expedition. The little incidents, as he called it, the little incidents that go to make up the sum of a day's work. These are the things I was interested in, as well as any of the alcohol consumption that was going on as well. We'll come to that in a moment. Among the personalities, and he was one of the prominent ones, was the artist, George Marston, who is shown there giving the Adelie penguins of Cape Royds an earful of gramophone music, as I've called music to breed by, and they are there setting up their nests, wondering what on earth's going on, I guess. But this was typical Marston. I mean, the ship was still there, the masts are in the background. There was still a lot of work to be done around setting up the camp and so on, but he seemed to have time to play around with the gramophone amongst the penguins. And here we are in the middle of winter. The photograph top left shows the gramophone again in operation, Marston operating it. Down to the bottom left, Frank Wild, some of you will have heard of him, an astounding and maybe one of the greatest of all Antarctic explorers. 6 winters and 5 expeditions he made to Antarctica. In the heroic era, I'm not sure anybody else managed to do that. Down the bottom left, the bottom right rather, is one of the cubicles. This one was the cubicle occupied by 2 Australian-based geologists, the Welshman Professor David Edgeworth. Edgeworth David rather. He was a 50-year-old, the oldest on the expedition, a professor of geology from the University of Sydney, and he was there with one of his students, Douglas Mawson. So this was Mawson's first time in Antarctica, and together they occupied that cubicle, which was typical of a great clutter of clothing and personal effects, and not much room to swing around in there at all. In the middle of the winter, that is in the shortest day, longest night, and of course it was longest night for 4 months for them, they had a celebration. They made it a Christmas celebration because, that was winter time and was when they celebrated in England Christmas. And the cook, Roberts, he produced an innovative menu involving some humour and some real stuff. So we got turtle soup there. But the interesting thing for me was that there was an attempt here to match some alcoholic beverage with the food. So you see the tracking down the left-hand column there, you see whisky alongside turtle soup. And then champagne, just for a little bit of variation, with the penguin patties. Champagne again with those seal cutlets. Whisky for the main course in there. And then down into the sweet, which was whisky again, funnily enough, with the plum pudding. Can you see there, Barbara? Can you? Okay, that's all right. And some coffee, cigars and cigarettes, and Frank Wild, who would have produced this along with Ernest Joyce, had a go at the end there at what the estate might have been, and because he had the first printing press, down there, and he garbled up the words there, so whisky and more whisky, as you can see down the bottom, and just as a little joke too, because this was Edwardian times and not long after Victorian times. Instead of carriages at a certain time of night when you were supposed to be carried home, he's got sledges at 12:30. Well, here are the sledges, and here are the Manchurian ponies, the 4 of them that were left, with the 4 who were trying to get to the South Pole. This was Britain's attempt to reach the South Pole for the first time. Here they are, just setting out from Hut Point on the Ross Ice Shelf. and it was a Herculean project, no doubt about that. They did make it farther south. They got to 88 degrees 23 minutes, which was about 150 kilometres from the South Pole, and decided, perhaps the greatest turning point in all exploration history, to turn back. They turned back because they knew they would never get back unless they did so. And what you've got, 4 of them turned into 3 in a photograph because someone had to take the photograph, and that was the Dr. Eric Marshall, who's out of picture. On the left is Jameson Adams, who was the second in command, a young lieutenant from the army. Frank Wild in the middle, the real hard man, and the storeman, who we would know where all the whiskey was kept, I should imagine, and was always often cited whenever there was any consumption of whiskey. And in the Shackleton on the right, you couldn't recognise them there, and you could hardly recognise them when they got back. There's Eric Marshall with his polar tent. He kept a pretty full journal. He was not only the photographer, but the cartographer as well. He was keeping track of where they were and how much to go and all that, and they had a pretty good idea of their situation and their position. It's a typical polar tent, not much different from what you have there today. But the important thing for me was that he left a journal unpublished that I had access to. And the journal gave a tremendous insight into just how people on that expedition were thinking of their leader. As we all know, he is a leader of world renown, and no one's disputing that, but there were niggles going on, and Eric Marshall was one of the strongest critics for a time, at least until he came towards the end of this South Pole bid, which far exceeded what Scott and his party had done. Because Eric Marshall got sick towards the end and had to be rescued by none other than Ernest Shackleton, and you can read about how that drama unfolded. But it is truly a dramatic story. Here they are at the end of that trip, looking, far older than their years, with Wild on the left, Shackleton, Eric Marshall at the back there, who was a tall guy, and Adams, the second in command, on the right. And this is, of course, at the same time. They only just made it back to the Nimrod. They had probably only a day's grace to alert anybody on the Nimrod to the fact they had returned, and they left very smartly after that. By this time it was March of 1909, and the sea ice was starting to close in on them. That's the same guy, Shackleton, around about the same time, and he returned. He certainly cleans up very nicely, doesn't he? He was a handsome figure with a wonderful presentation and of course a reputation. He is Sir Ernest Shackleton because of this expedition, not because of the Endurance one. This is where he achieved his great fame. It wasn't the last time he went on Antarctica, because after the Endurance expedition he left from Dunedin to go to rescue his support party, the Ross Sea Support Party, in 1916-17 summer, and he left from here. That was the last time he would have seen Antarctica. So we move now to the last part of the book and the story, which does turn us into two aspects of it. One is what happened to the hut. They didn't take it down. In fact, Shackleton left it there with 1 year's supply of food and beverages. But for 30 years no one went near it after he had left with his Ross Sea Support Party, the survivors. Incidentally, 3 of them died. So when you see that Shackleton never lost a man in any of his expeditions, you have to qualify that by saying he never lost a man under his direct command. So they lost 3 men, including the leader there, Amos McIntosh. They weren't staying here, however. They were staying in Scott's Terra Nova hut to the south of Cape Royds. So this place just stayed abandoned for 30 years. And in 1947, a ship called Burton Island, which I've sailed on too, an icebreaker, arrived with an American expedition. And although they didn't go to look at the hut at that time, the following year, 1948, another icebreaker came in, an American one, and they did look at the hut. But the first New Zealanders in there were in 1957 with Ed Hillary's party looking at what was the remains of the hut. And this is the picture from that time. The most prominent thing you can see there is a picture of the royal couple, King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. Even though it was all shut up and hardly any windows in it for any snow to get in, snow did get in. And you see that white stuff there is all frozen snow around some of the things they left. They left in a hurry, and there's some wonderful descriptions of of what people found when they went there. 30, 40, 50 years later, 30 or 40 years later, they found frozen bread, a meal on the table, this sort of thing, as though people had just left. There are some ghostly stories about this, including one from Ed Hillary himself, which he told me about, and I include that in the book. I won't elaborate on that now. They're pretty impressive. There were some New Zealand biologists there as well. The first two were Ewan Young, a professor later from Auckland University, but he was from Canterbury at this time, and Rowley Taylor, another biologist who was studying the penguins. They were both studying birds, yes, penguins and skuas, and took some note also of the Waddell seals there. And then there were a couple of following seasons. The hut was occupied by them, but this is actually Rowley Taylor trying to get some warmth out of the stove. As you can see, he's wearing a balaclava and very cold weather gear inside the hut. He told me, he lives in Nelson now, that any warmth that he could get out of the stove was purely imaginary. There were others there too, and I'm thinking of Oliver Sullivan and a man who's with us today, John Darby from Wanaka. John, put up your hand there. He was there in 63-4 summer. Some of you might have heard of the book Forbush and the Penguins, which Graham Billing wrote. It was claimed to be the first novel out of Antarctica, but wasn't really. But it is a hell of a good read. It's a great story of a young biologist staying at Cape Royds in Shackleton's hut, and staying and living there for the whole summer, and what he went through, the storms and all the rest of it. A very good read if you can find a copy of it. John Darby was a biologist working down there too on penguins, but it's not based on his experience, but rather that of Oliver Sullivan. No one looked under the hut for a very long time. It was all kind of frozen up under there, and really the New Zealand teams that were conserving the hut and protecting it and conserving also all of the artefacts had enough of a job. 5,000 or 6,000 artefacts in one hut, let alone the Scots' two huts that were also to the south on Ross Island. So they had plenty of work to do without looking underneath the hut. But in 2006 someone did, and thought they could see these cases, some cases. It wasn't until the following summer that they could take a picture like that showed quite clearly the manufacturer and they could actually start thinking about removing at least the 3 whisky cases. But that happened in 2009-10 summer. It took that long because to arrange what they would do with it. I mean, that no one knew whether there was any whisky worth saving or worth sampling in there at all. They could see into the top of one because the case had been jemmied by somebody and there was a bottle missing. But who had taken that? I'm not going to tell you. I have a theory about that, as I do about the missing bottle I'll come to shortly. But anyway, I present it in the book. you know, that Cape Royds is such a special place. There's hardly another place to match it for historic interest and scientific interest. Both, for both reasons, it is protected under the Antarctic Treaty, and you are not allowed to take anything out of there ordinarily. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs signed off on the question of an application to remove one case, and you can see some guys there moving it, and they're moving it up to Canterbury Museum, one of the three. It was a solid block of ice weighing 40 kilograms when it arrived in a Hercules, or was it a jet, but anyway, arrived by air at Christchurch, and the Canterbury Museum placed it in the specially built cool room, let's call it that, and over 3 weeks the case was thawed. It was also hooked up to a web camera, and so people around the world could see progress with this. The story started to get legs of its own. The whole thing went viral on Facebook. People were just so clamouring for information about this and so fascinated by the story of a 100-year-old whisky. White and Mackay were the owners of the McKinley brand. McKinley's had stopped producing the whisky. The Glenmore distillery closed in 1993, so it was all up to White and Mackay now to make the play for sampling the bottles. They said it was a very good case. New Zealand was trying to help them and argued that you could justify taking 3 bottles out and flying them back, but they had to be very careful with them, as I'll come to in a minute. First of all, though, we had to have a look to see if there were anything worth sending, because that case was leaking some whisky, and one of the bottles was found to be cracked. The rest, however, were intact. So 3 bottles were selected. I should have explained that's Lizzie Mead, the artefacts program manager from the Antarctic Heritage Trust, who was actually they're the agency based in Christchurch that has been looking after the heritage sites in Antarctica, and they organised this project, this transport back to Christchurch, and the sending on of 3 bottles that looked like that when you took the straw off them. The straw was a cushion, obviously, for their travel by sea, and once they got there, all of the bottles apparently survived those tremendous seas on the way south. Horrendous conditions on board, and even seamen had been at sea for 30 years or 40 years were getting seasick. But there you can just sort of see underneath the tissue paper, and the straw was around that. You can see the tissue advertising what it is, rare old Highland malt whisky from McKinley's of Leith and Inverness. And there are the 3 bottles that were flown back in a private jet, an Airbus owned by this guy here on the left, an Indian billionaire called Dr. Vijay Mallya. He owns White and Mackay, as he owns Kingfisher Air and all kinds of companies, particularly in the wine and spirits area, and he's holding there one of the original bottles. Alongside him, though, is a man rather more important to the story. He is the master blender from White and Mackay, Richard Patterson, 3rd generation master blender for that company, and quite an amazing character in himself, and he's holding a bottle that was recovered in 1956-7 summer from the hut by an American officer, naval officer, who presented it back to McKinley's in London. And that bottle's been in the McKinley family now for some time, over 50 years. But they were interested in seeing it because they could handle it, and obviously it had nothing in it. It was used as a candlestick holder inside the Cape Royds hut. So the chemists got stuck in, and abiding by the rules that New Zealand set for the processing of this, they couldn't open the capsule, take the capsule off, there was a lead capsule on it, and inside a cork. What they had to do was insert a syringe in, and a second one that actually gave some air so they could suck out samples. and what they took out of the 3 bottles was about 1 litre of whisky. They were amazed at how it looked, because the very first thing you think of, if the whole box had been, the case had been frozen, is that probably the whisky froze too, and that would have turned the whisky cloudy with the precipitation of ethyl esters in it. But no, out it came like that, like a beautiful clear amber liquid, and they were quite thrilled with it. And they put it through the most modern testing and analysis that you could imagine, all kinds of modern scientific equipment. They were looking at the sugars, at the ethyl esters, at the anions, cations, at the metals, at the alcohol content of it, which turned out to be 47.19%, and was the reason why it hadn't froze. As you know, alcohol takes a lot to freeze alcohol, and if it was anything around sort of 30 to 35% of alcohol content, it would have frozen. That accords with temperature readings that have been taken from the hut inside and outside the hut at Cape Royds. The minimum temperature in 2010 winter, for example, was minus 32 degrees inside the hut. So that wasn't going to do the trick of freezing it. And apparently nothing did for over 100 years. This is the chief chemist here, James Pride, whom I met in the laboratory at Invergordon, and who gave me a couple of hours of his time. He's holding one of the bottles that they've already sampled. I saw all 3 bottles because they have to be returned to Antarctica. They haven't been yet, and that is one of the loose ends in the story, I guess, but the pressure is going on White and Mackay to get them out here before Christmas. But James Pride said to me, as you can read there, the fact the spirit stayed intact and was drinkable after 100 years just blew me away. It blew away this guy as well too. He described it, Richard Patterson, as the whisky find of the century. I'm not sure which he was meaning, last century or this one, but anyway, a century. And there he is there, I photographed him in his sample room. He recreated it out of 25 different whiskies and tried to get around about the 10-year age as an average of those various distillations to match up with what Shackleton had ordered. He is a historian himself and has written a book, with the lovely title "Goodness Knows," spelled N-O-S-E, because his nose has been insured for $2.6 million US, but he can't afford the premiums on it now, so he's let that lapse. He has 1,000 different samples, whisky samples, in this laboratory here, and has just recently, well, in fact, when I was meeting him in May, was producing what he called Shack 2. They don't call it quite as irreverently as that now in their marketing, but nonetheless, it is a second release of a replica whisky. He and James Pride and one other guy, an independent English whisky expert called Dave Broom, are only 3 people that I know of who've tasted the original and obviously tasted the recreation. And Dave Broom said, you just have to take his word for it, that the recreation was bang on. White and Mackay produced 50,000 bottles of it and spread it around the world. In New Zealand, they sold for anything from $250 to $300 each. And in England and Scotland for £100, 5 pounds of which from every bottle is going to the Antarctic Heritage Trust. Which reminds me to say, in case I don't do it at the end, when Marion maybe on the desk there, that part of the proceeds from my royalties will go to the Antarctic Heritage Trust as well. There's the packaging, there's the bottle of the recreated whisky. It's a kind of a coup, I think, for marketing. They've tried to reproduce the wooden case and with the original insignia on it and wording on it as well. On the top of that bottle, you can't read it there, but it just says especially prepared for the British Antarctic Expedition 1907 ship, Endurance. An obvious mistake. But it wasn't really, because McKinley's were told by Shackleton that he wanted to change the name of Nimrod to Endurance, but never got around to it. And it was, of course, it wasn't until the 1914-17 expedition that he had a ship by that name. Just to finish off with a couple of slides, we've got a couple of minutes. Yeah. Here is 90-year-old Donald McKinley, who's the father of Neil. I showed you a picture of Neil with the order, Shackleton's order. Well, here's his father with this bottle, original bottle that was picked up in 1956-7 summer by an American Navy officer, and eventually got back to London. I'm not sure what happened. There was a lot of souveniring going on around those years, through the 60s and even in the 70s when I was there. But generally speaking, New Zealand tried to keep an eye on it. You know, we couldn't be having an escort for everybody who went there, but these days there is an escort and things are very strictly controlled. Donald McKinley feels that that is the missing bottle. And I have further speculated on who might have taken it out of the case from underneath the hut. And just the second last picture now is come out into modern times. In 2007, descendants of the Nimrod expeditioners retraced the footsteps of the Shackleton South Pole expedition and got there. And you see them around the symbolic sphere there, that metal sphere. And in the middle is the leader, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Worsley, and that Worsley, of course, is from descendant of Frank Worsley, who was the Shackleton's captain in the Endurance expedition. On the left is a descendant of Shackleton family, and on the right, a descendant of Adams, second in command. They retraced it so carefully that they arrived at the farthest south, 88 degrees 23 minutes south, on the same day, in January in 2007, 100 years after Shackleton. But the important thing for me was that they had taken Shackleton's compass. You can't read it there, but on the lid of it, which is opened, are the initials EHS, Ernest Henry Shackleton. Shackleton never made it to the South Pole, as you now know, but he could have the satisfaction where he's still around to know that it finally got there. These three guys did not walk back, however. They flew out, courtesy of the Americans, but they were thrilled to do it. I was thrilled to make contact with Lieutenant Colonel Worsley, thanks to the internet. I could never have done this book project in 1 year without it, without emails, without the incredible capacity of search engines to ferret people out. So I found him, found an email address for him, and he very kindly replied, because my question was, did he have a photograph of the compass at the South Pole? And he said, yes, I do. I happen to be in a place I can't tell you at the moment, just simply call it Afghanistan, on assignment by the British Army in some back blocks of Afghanistan, some war zone. So here he is seeing me from that rather terrible distant location. The two pictures you see there of the compass and of the three men on that. And finally, this is the granddaughter of Ernest Shackleton, this is Alexandra, and presumably for Queen Alexandra, I think that's what she says, with the compass that she lent to Henry Worsley and his comrades, and she has it there, photographing her at her home at Hammersmith. And she was a very great help to me too, to try to set the scene a little bit for me. She is quite a character herself, like Richard Patterson, and I think think for the very first time, tasted whisky when he presented her with the recreation of her grandfather's ordered McKinley's rare old Highland malt whisky. So thank you very much for that. We've probably gone over time, have we?
No, you've done
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. Maybe the time for some discussion or some questions. Yeah. Are there any questions? It's always an embarrassment, isn't it, really? So, if there's none, Paul.
Now, was the whisky blended in order specifically that it wouldn't freeze in the Antarctic, or was that just good luck?
That's a good question. I think both Richard Patterson and the McKinley descendants believe that this was a whisky crafted for polar experience. And that's why they made it at 47%. Some of you will know that whisky and the new make spirit of it is at 70%, and then it slowly loses alcohol content as it's evaporating to the angel share and so on, or watered down. But yes, the answer is probably yes, they did craft this in two ways. One, that alcohol content had to be very high to avoid the freezing, the severe cold that you find in Antarctica. It also, and I think this is where a little bit of sort of the modern development of whiskies, Scotch whiskies anyway, comes in, because McKinley's was just starting to enter the American market around that time, and they knew that the rather robust and harsh whiskies that you could get, the very highly peated ones out of Scotland, probably wouldn't go down well in America, and they made what would be called these days a ladies' whisky, and that's the way it's described to, generally speaking, described too, and it suited some of those expeditioners, people like Frank Wilde, Ernest Joyce, Alistair Mackay, and a few others, but it didn't suit a lot of them. Raymond Priestley, and some of you will know, went back with Scott. He hardly touched it. Shackleton himself probably never even went near it. Shackleton would drink some liqueurs on expedition when he was out sledging, and back at the hut I've recorded that he drank champagne. Whisky might have been a step too far for him, and his family upbringing and all that education he had around that against alcohol. Thanks for that. Barbara.
Yeah, well, do you think if Scott had said to Shackleton, sure, go ahead and use my hut, do you think his expedition would have made the South Pole?
Yeah. The question is, if Shackleton had been allowed to use the Discovery hut at Hut Point by Scott, would he have made the South Pole? There's 40 kilometres between Royds and Hut Point. That's not really the issue, because they actually used Hut Point anyway as a staging place, as a place where they could set out with their supplies. They took supplies that far, and then they kept them there for a time, and then distributed them down onto the Ross Ice Shelf as far as they could go, depots of food and fuel. So really they were using the Discovery hut. As for whether it would have been more cosy for that expedition, from my experience there, and maybe John's and others who've been there to the Discovery hut, no, it wasn't really a friendly hut for people. It was designed in the manner of an Australian outback bungalow, with as though it was coming in for some extreme heat, with verandas all round it. But of course it wasn't, and really even the Discovery expedition didn't use it as a permanent home for anyone. They just stayed aboard their ship, and it froze in over 2 winters. So the question is probably not. No, it wouldn't have made any difference if they'd used that. Right, sir.
How would you weigh up Shackleton in a few words? And that's probably an impossible task, but having read a little bit about him, he seems to attract extreme loyalty and quite hearty dislike. I mean, it is obviously quite a very complex character. It's hard to get a grip on him, really.
Yeah, it is. He's an X-Factor personality, and no doubt about that. And he could pull some terrific crowds. I mean, I was just listening to a radio description of the Hobbits and all of that going on there. This is the kind of hero worship that he could command. Was he a great leader? The jury's out on that. I mean, I think it was overall. He had incredible endurance. In fact, that's his family motto. By endurance we conquer. And yet, he could upset people on an expedition, and you'll read about that in this book. Some amazing derogatory comments from people, even from Frank Wilde himself. But it took that South Pole journey to turn Wilde round into a real admirer and supporter. And as you know, he went back 2 times for another 2 expeditions with Shackleton. Like all great persons, and particularly great explorers, I mean, you sometimes left wondering how great was he. But I think it was pretty great, and certainly what he did was inspired by example. Unlike some explorers, and you could even accuse Scott of this, unlike some explorers, Shackleton would not let any man do anything that he could not himself do, and he did everything else. I mean, he was doing the rosters, overnight watch, fire watch rosters and so on, like everybody else. And when it was his turn, it was his turn, and he did it. He wasn't a Royal Navy man, he was a Merchant Navy man. Sorry.
As someone who started the fleet in grade 6 at primary school, it seems like an excessive amount of doesn't it, to transport all that way?
You're just talking about the whiskey or everything?
All of it.
Yeah, all of it, yeah.
Doesn't it seem like
Yeah, it does. It's 300 bottles in 25 cases. Some of it was drunk on the way out by the Nimrod crew, and only 2 of Shackleton's expedition team were on board, but one of them didn't actually like the whiskey, so even though he was a Scotsman. I was wondering the same thing, actually, and it wasn't until I consulted a Royal Navy commander about how much rum the Royal Navy would have got through on a daily tot that I could put it in perspective. So I will give you this, this is the message I write, and that is that a daily tot of rum is 71 millilitres, and if you extrapolate that out, 71 millilitres of whiskey, just taking the whiskey, over 13 months and 15 men, and if they all took it, you would need twice as much. You need 600 bottles to cover it. But as you pointed out, there's plenty of, there's champagne, there's wine, there's port, there's brandy, there's liqueurs, went on and on. And you have to give Shackleton his due. He'd come from a temperance attitude as a young man to ordering all that whiskey and all that other alcohol.